Just as I started to make this video, this morning, 27th August, morning I should say in London, news came through from Moscow that the investigative committee, the law enforcement organization which in Russia investigates high-profile criminal cases and which some compare to the FBI of the United States. Anyway, the investigative committee has now confirmed the following DNA tests and other tests. Yevgeny Prigozhin's body has been identified conclusively amongst the bodies that were found in the area of the air crash. Apparently, the investigative committee has carried out other checks on other bodies amongst the bodies that were found in the area of the crash, and they have been able to confirm that all of the people who were listed as travelling on the plane are indeed the people whose bodies have been found. So the list of people who were killed and the list of the people whose bodies have been found exactly matches. Now, I'm not going to spend more time on this program, or much more time on this program, discussing Prigozhin. Given his multiple identities, his ability to move around the world, his propensity for secrecy, his habit of using disguises, I think it's fair to say that there needed to be confirmation that he was dead of this kind before people fully accepted it. I think that after this information, we should accept it now. The other people who have died in the crash consist of the military leadership of Wagner, as I've discussed many times in many programs. Prigozhin himself, despite his tremendous powers of leadership, his charisma and his intelligence, was never someone with any kind of military background, no previous experience or knowledge of command, and it would be a mistake to imagine that he was in direct command of Wagner in any particular way. It's been suggested that the person who was in command of Wagner, the military leader who was actually running Wagner, was Dmitry Utkin, former GRU officer. I now have it on very good authority that he was actually, throughout this entire period and right up to the moment of his death in the plane crash, actually a serving GRU officer. In other words, a serving officer of Russian military intelligence. Anyway, he too has been killed in this crash, and that has deprived Wagner of its military leadership as well as its political leadership. There's going to be much speculation about the background to this story. We'll see what the Russian investigation comes up with. I should say that my source, who has been close to Wagner, has been in touch with me again. He has pointed out absolutely correctly that he contacted me 2 months ago, directly after the collapse of the Prigozhin mutiny, that 2 months from that moment, all kinds of things would start to happen, that all sorts of people would be arrested, that there would be attempts to bring Wagner to heel, and of course, in terms of timing at least, he has been proved absolutely right. He's provided me with more information, which I'm still working my way through. I think until I do that, I'm going to wait before I discuss Wagner and this affair again. But anyway, Prigozhin is dead, Utkin is dead, Wagner is coming under a lot of pressure, people have been arrested, people have been questioned, all kinds of things apparently taking place. I still, myself, don't believe that Putin himself was directly involved, or even Russian government structures. There's been an opinion poll on this very topic published in the London Times, which interestingly said that only 9% of Russians think that Putin had any part at all in Prigozhin's death, which is quite interesting. It shows that people in Russia have a very different view of this affair from some people in the West and of who was responsible. I would say that this particular opinion poll was organised from outside Russia and was conducted by a Western-backed agency. And, well, for what it's worth, it does seem to reflect Russian opinion. The organisers of this opinion poll seem to have been rather disappointed, by the way, by the result. But anyway, putting all that aside, I still personally think, for all the reasons I've given before, that Putin himself almost certainly wasn't involved, that the Russian authorities almost certainly were not involved. But of course, I will maintain an open mind and I will see what comes. Anyway, that's what I get to say about Wagner today and about Prigozhin today. He is dead, an important player on the political scene, both in Russia and Ukraine and Africa, has been removed from it. The repercussions of this, the consequences, we will have to wait and see. What else has been going on? Well, lots has been going on, and it seems to me that three things now stand out. Firstly, the conflict in Ukraine, which I still consider to be the epicenter of the epicenter of the changes in the international system that we have been witnessing over the last year and a half. The second is the moves by BRICS to undertake expansion, and I get to say some things today about the state of the Chinese economy and about Chinese-Indian relations. And last but not least, the growing danger of a conflict in West Africa, with ECOWAS apparently having made a decision to intervene in Niger militarily, and with a 12,000-man intervention force having been brought together with a view to carrying out that very intervention. But let's start with the situation in Ukraine. And I should say that the information from the battlefronts over the last 24 hours has been thin, which is always interesting in itself. Thin, but not non-existent. There was a very substantial Russian drone and missile attack across Ukraine over the course of last night. I've not seen much information about what it achieved exactly, but anyway, it did take place, and these attacks have become routine. Now, Ukraine has, as I've discussed previously, been making numerous attacks on targets in Russia on a far smaller scale than what Russia is capable of. I discussed about a week ago an article that had appeared in the Guardian, which said that the effect of the drone strikes on Moscow had been minimal, that they'd not affected Russian morale. And now there's been a further article confirming the same thing in the Daily Telegraph. And I'm not going to read the entire article, but it contains comments like this. Ukrainian officials have claimed that strikes deep inside Russia are intended to wake its people up to the reality of war. But survivors of the drone strikes doubt the attacks will change the minds of Russians, especially those who back the invasion. And then we hear that a quotation from a psychiatrist. Unless it affects someone personally, it could leave people indifferent, or it could cause an even sharper polarization of views. I suspect when a drone flies into your house, those who were not pro-war or were undecided may start to side with the government. And we then go on to read, one of the hardest hit districts in Moscow is Moscow City, the capital's financial hub, where several office blocks and residential towers have been targeted by Ukrainian drones in recent weeks. While multiple estate agents have reported viewings for Moscow City apartments being cancelled, many residents and those who work in the district seem completely unfazed. When a drone hit for the first time, I never heard anything, Vladislav Ivanov, a resident, told APTN only hours after a fresh attack last Sunday. When it happened just now, I didn't hear anything either, so what should I be afraid of? So, and then it goes on to say, the article goes on to say, a weekly survey by Russia's state-owned pollster FOM that maps perceived anxiety in Russia did show a sharp rise in reported levels of anxiety in the week after the May 3rd drone attack on the Kremlin, but subsequent polls do not indicate any significant public reaction to the drone hits that ensued. So, there we go. Another proof of the point I've been making for weeks on these programs, that these pinprick attacks by Ukraine achieve nothing. They are theatre. Perhaps they lift morale in Ukraine a little, though I doubt by very much. Perhaps they make for news stories that the Western media can publish on quiet days. But in terms of their actual impact on the war, they are inconsequential. And anybody who has been to Moscow and is familiar with the city and the size of the city will immediately understand why. And I would add to that, of course, the temper of the people, who, of course, have a far deeper knowledge of war than is something that we are accustomed to in the West. Though I would add that drone attacks on this scale would probably not make much of an effect, even in some Western cities like London, for example. Anyway, putting all that aside, what has actually been going on the actual front lines? Because ultimately that's where the war is going to be decided. Now, yesterday I read in the Daily Telegraph, perhaps not always the most reliable source, a further euphoric claim that Ukraine has finally broken through the toughest Russian defense lines, and that from this moment on the offensive will accelerate and Ukraine is about to advance all the way to Berdyansk and to the Sea of Azov. And in fact, it was quite an interesting article, shortish article, but a very interesting article, because in some ways it contradicted its own claims. It was based on a report by a Ukrainian officer. He wasn't identified by name, but he is involved in the fighting in and around the village of Rabotino. And this officer was quoted as saying that Rabotino is largely captured by Ukraine. The Russians still control 2 houses on the southern outskirts, but once Ukraine has consolidated its positions in Rabotino, it will be able to advance more quickly, or so he thinks, and he sort of made it clear that this was his opinion. He didn't know this for a fact. And he also said that he thought that the densest, most difficult minefields would now have been bypassed. They wouldn't be interfering with the Ukrainian advance to the same degree. And that he did hope that as a result of that, the offensive would gather pace And he did also say, of course, that the ultimate objective of the Ukrainians was not Rabotino, but Berdyansk, the port city on the Sea of Azov. Now, the point is that, of course, what this article actually did was that it admitted that the Russians still had a presence in Rabotino. It might, according to this officer, have been just 2 houses, but still, there they were. The Russians still had positions in Rabotino. And as has been so often the case in this conflict, what was reported yesterday, especially in the Western media, turned out to be over-optimistic, because Russian forces in the Rabotino area have been reinforced, and paratroopers have been holding the line over the last couple of days. The regular army regiment that has been defending Rabotino has been pulled back for rest and refit, but it's been replaced by paratroopers, drawn, as I understand it, from Kherson region, and now they've been replaced by Marines, rather not replaced, but reinforced by Marines, naval infantry, or so I understand. There's also been an accumulation of Russian artillery in the area, and as I discussed yesterday, the Russians have gone on the counterattack. They've recaptured some ground in Rabotino, and to the best of my understanding, the village, this small village, is now divided into 3 parts. A northern part where the Ukrainians are present, a southern part greater than just 2 houses where the Russians are embedded, and an area in the middle which is essentially grey zone. Sometimes Ukrainian soldiers enter it, sometimes Russian soldiers enter it, but neither side ultimately is able to control it. So despite all the efforts, all the attempts by Ukraine to capture Rabotino and to move beyond Rabotino, so far they've not managed to do it. And one report that I've seen goes well beyond claims I've noticed that the Russian Defense Ministry is making. It claims that there's around 30 Ukrainian vehicles littering the landscape, littering parts of this village, which are the results of the fighting that have been taking place in Rabotino over the last week or so, as Ukraine has made strenuous attempts to capture this village, but seems for the moment to have been unable to do so. Now, the Institute for the Study of War acknowledges that Russian positions in Rabotino have been reinforced. It claims that the troops who have been reinforcing Russian positions in Rabotino come from the north, that the Russians have redeployed troops in the Kupiansk area to hold the line in Rabotino. I think this is actually wrong. My understanding is that the forces that have been deployed in Kupiansk do not include Marines or paratroopers, that in fact the troops who were holding the line at Rabotino were drawn, paratroopers were redeployed from Kherson region further to the west, and of course the naval infantry, the Marines, have been very present in this area all along. The forces concentrated in and around Kupiansk, where the Russians have been on the offensive, tend to be heavier, more heavily equipped regular infantry and tank units. And there's been some reports that the Russians have been carrying out a redeployment, that they've been reinforcing, not reducing, the number of their troops in Kupiansk. They've gained a lot of ground over the last few weeks. There's been intense fighting. Ukraine continues to counterattack the Russian forces in and around Kupiansk. So the men and machines in the Russian units that have been pushing towards Kupiansk have become, to some extent, tired. They need rest, they need reinforcing, and apparently that is what has been happening over the last couple of days, all on the eve of what pretty much everybody now anticipates will be a Russian assault on Kupiansk. And this, of course, is very much the style of what the Russians do. They don't attack directly, they don't attack immediately. They build up their forces, they capture the surrounding villages. In the case of Kupiansk, we're talking about Sinkovka and Petropavlovka. Once they're ready, once all the forces are in place, once the artillery is in place, once the supply lines into Kupiansk, across the bridges, across the Oskol River, have been degraded, that's when the Russians attack. And that's the pattern of what we seem to be seeing happen at the moment. By the way, there have been reports that the Russians have been on the move somewhere else, and this is in Vuhledar, another of these places, another of these towns. This is in southern Donbass, not very far from the fighting that's been taking place in Zaporozhye region and in the Vremivka salient area. But again, there's been reports that the Russians have undertaken some kind of further advance in the Vuhledar area. I think that the Russians made a serious attempt to capture Vuhledar in the winter. It didn't come off, partly apparently because of errors by the local commander, which gave Ukraine time to reinforce in the Vuhledar area, and the Russians did suffer losses in these attacks, though not on the scale that I see some people insist. I'm confident about that also. But anyway, for what it's worth, the Russians have launched some sort of further attack in the Vuhledar area. We'll see what that amounts to. And again, further north from Vuhledar, there's been another Russian advance or counterattack in the Klesheyevka area, this village, which is a bit like Rabotino and Pyatikhatki on the Zaporozhye fronts and Kherson front lines. Ukraine has been trying to capture. Well, it seems that the Russians have again launched a counterattack, pushing the Ukrainian forces away from Klesheyevka, a village which Ukraine at one point entered. There were reports at one point that, as was the case with Rabotino, Ukraine controlled up to half of this village, but it seems they've been pushed out and that the village, Klesheyevka, is fully again under Russian control. So all of this pointing again to a Ukrainian offensive that is ebbing. Ukraine is still trying to push forward in a number of places, but each of its attacks are repelled. Ukraine suffers losses. Sometimes Ukraine pulls together troops to make a big effort in one particular place, as it did over the course of the last week in Rabotino. Other weeks it's tried to do the same thing in Klesheyevka. In no case, however, have the Ukrainians achieved a breakthrough. And we're now at the 27th of August. Autumn, not that far off now. And, of course, the unanswered question, the level of Ukrainian ammunition stocks, probably depleting. Lots of reports that Ukraine is only able to concentrate heavy artillery fire in specific focused locations. a general feeling that the Ukrainian offensive is ebbing and that losses in men and machines have become so high that even if a local breakthrough were achieved in some place or other, Ukraine now lacks the critical mass to be able to push on to the Sea of Azov. Anyway, that's, I think, the widespread view. We'll see what, if anything, Ukraine does do. I will say this, I have seen a few scattered reports that even in the Rabotino area and on the Vremivka salient area, the Ukrainians are now starting to take the first steps towards establishing fortifications. Obviously, these are nothing like as elaborate as those that the Russians have, but that it could be that the Ukrainians are starting to worry that their offensive is indeed beginning to lose steam, and that the Russians, it will be the Russians who will be on the attack before long. Anyway, that's the situation on the battlefronts, and I think it's fair to say that Ukraine is now hitting the wall wherever it tries to attack. Piatikhatki, on the east bank of Kherson region, east bank of the Dnieper River in Kherson region, near Rabotino, on the Vremivka salient area, in the Bakhmut area. In no place has Ukraine been able to break through, and I think this is now generally acknowledged. And we continue to receive reports of arguments between Ukrainian military leaders and Western military leaders. Now, in several recent programs, I've discussed a rather intense meeting that took place between three Western military leaders: General Mark Milley, who is the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States; General Karolyi, a US general who is the overall commander of NATO forces in Europe; and Admiral Radakin, who is a senior, in fact, the most senior British officer. Now, I assumed that this meeting, or meetings, had taken place in a virtual format. But there's now confirmation from Ukraine that at least one of these meetings, which took place about 11 or 12 days ago, actually took place in a secret location in western Ukraine. And it seems that Zaluzhny attended this meeting with all his most senior officers. Apparently even Syrskyi was there, and that this was a major encounter between the military leadership of the West and that of Ukraine. And if this meeting is the same meeting as has been talked about by the New York Times and by the Wall Street Journal, which I, by the way, suspect it is, then we can see that the meeting didn't go well, that the Americans and the British continued to pile on the pressure for Ukraine to accelerate the offensive in the southern front lines, to call off the fighting in Bakhmut, to concentrate everything they have on pushing through the Russian fortified lines south of Rabotino and in the Vremivka salient area, but specifically south of Rabotino, to break through the Russian fortifications, to push through the Russian minefields, to break through all the way to Tokmak and beyond Tokmak to Melitopol, and ultimately to Berdyansk on the Sea of Azov And it seems that Zaluzhny simply said to them, or tried to get them to understand, that what they are demanding is unrealistic, that Ukraine simply doesn't have the force to do what they say. It lacks the air power, it lacks the long-range missiles. Well, he's been complaining about that for a long time. But what he perhaps didn't say is that it lacks the men. They don't have that enormous preponderance of men and machines that would be needed, and artillery and shells that would be needed to break through this dense, structured defense that the Russians have created in this area. And it seems that there have been arguments, perhaps not at this particular meeting, but further arguments about the Kupiansk situation as well. It seems that the Western commanders have been downplaying the significance of the Russian advance towards Kupiansk. There's been hints to that effect, statements to that effect, in the British Ministry of Defence briefings. Whereas the Ukrainians, people like General Syrskyi, are sounding the alarm bells and saying that Ukraine urgently needs to send reinforcements to hold the line in Kupiansk, to prevent Kupiansk from falling, and to prevent a Russian advance beyond the Oskol River. And Syrskyi, in effect, has been demanding that troops from Ukraine's reserve be deployed to hold the positions in Kupiansk. The Western military leaders categorically refused, and the result has been that the 82nd Air Assault Brigade, with its Strykers and its Marders and presumably its Challenger 2s, and the so-called Maroon Tactical Group, another reserve formation in the Ukrainian reserves, instead of being sent to contain the situation in Kupiansk, well, they've been redeployed to Rabotino instead, where there have been all these attacks on Rabotino, which so far appear to have achieved little. And in fact, there was a report today that the 82nd Brigade has suffered such heavy losses that it has had to be reinforced with units from a different brigade, the 46th Brigade, to try to make up the numbers in terms of manpower. Now, I've had a number of people writing to me about the Kupiansk situation, and yesterday I had a particularly interesting email from a private correspondent. I'm not going to identify him, but he does have a military background. And he too thinks that the West is complacent about the Kupiansk situation. They're so focused on breaking the land bridge, pushing through to the Sea of Azov, that they're taking their eye off the ball, and that they're not recognizing how dangerous the situation in Kupiansk can potentially become. And in the opinion of this correspondent, Kupiansk, far from being a diversion by the Russians, an attempt to conduct an offensive with the view of getting the Ukrainians to ease off on their offensive in the south by perhaps redeploying troops from their southern front lines to try to hold the line in Kupiansk. Far from that being the purpose of this offensive towards Kupiansk. Instead, it is a precursor to a much bigger advance by the Russians. It will be the main axis of their autumn offensive, which some people on the Russian side, including Russian officials, are now openly saying is coming. And according to this correspondent, the West's failure to take the Kupiansk situation seriously and to allow the Ukrainians to redeploy their forces to try to hold the line in Kupiansk and perhaps go onto a general offensive could be a precursor once the Russian offensive gets underway to a major debacle in the north, one which might affect the entire direction of the war. Well, I think this sounds like sense to me. I'm not, as I've said many times, somebody with a military background. There may be logistical and infrastructural problems here that I am not really able to assess. Perhaps Ukrainian defences in this area are stronger than is being suggested. But if things do turn out the way this correspondent says, and he's not the only person I know who thinks in this way, well, we will have seen yet again that Western advice, military advice to Ukraine has been consistently bad. It has led Ukraine into doing things which, frankly, were misconceived, and that this offensive in the south, far from being an offensive which could win the war, by obliging Ukraine to concentrate its forces against the most densely fortified area of the Russian positions, well, instead of winning the war for Ukraine, it might conceivably lose it. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about the military situation. There have been more articles, including an interesting one in the National Interest, about the West's inability to maintain in production of weapons on anything like the scale needed to match the needs Ukraine has in this war, let alone equal what the Russians are producing in terms of weapons at the moment. But I'm going to just float one further thought. The fact that this meeting between the Western military leaders and Zelensky took place in person, that it was not just a video conference, to my mind, is an important fact in itself. And it seems to me that there are two possibilities, which are not, by the way, mutually exclusive. Possibility one is that the Western powers insisted on this meeting, which it was clearly they that insisted upon it, because they generally think that the Ukrainians aren't following advice properly, and that they really did come along to try to impress on Zelensky and Syrsky and on all of the others the absolute overriding necessity of sacrificing everything to the cause of the southern offensive. This is how Ukraine is going to win the war, and that the Western military and political leadership are generally exasperated by Ukraine's failure to understand this, and that they came together in this meeting in order to basically push the Ukrainians into understanding what they must do. So that's one theory. And the other theory, and I want to stress, these two theories are not mutually exclusive, is that it had a somewhat different purpose, which is to prepare the ground for a significant reduction of support for Ukraine in the war. In other words, you stage a meeting like this, you have the argument with Zelensky and the other military leaders, you throw all the blame for everything that's going wrong upon them, you give all your advice, bad as it is. When the advice fails to achieve the outcome that you say it should, you say again that it's Ukraine that's simply not following the advice it's been given, that you've done everything you possibly can, that you've met with the Ukrainian leaders, that you've tried to argue with them, argue sense into them, that they're not listening, that they're frittering away the valuable equipment that the West has provided on multiple fronts instead of concentrating on the single most important one, that you've done all you can, you therefore can wash your hands of the whole Ukrainian affair and walk away. So it could be that the purpose of this meeting in Western Ukraine, its actual purpose, was not to reactivate the offensive, as has been suggested, but rather to prepare the ground for America's and for the West's retreat. Now, as I've said, the two are not mutually exclusive. Of course, it could be the case that the Western leaders are saying to each other, well, let's try one last time to get the Ukrainians to act in the way that we want them to, and then we will pull out. Maybe we are acting sincerely in giving our advice. But if this meeting is eventually the key meeting, the key last meeting between the Western leaders and Ukraine, following which the decision, or at least the purported decision, to scale down support for Ukraine will be made, well, I have to say, all of the indications would be consistent with that being the case. Now, I ought to say there have been reports, there was that report in the Wall Street Journal, that the United States cannot provide Ukraine with more support next year, at least not on the scale of what it has provided this year, so that there will be a reduction in support from the West to Ukraine next year. And in fact, this is not choice, as I've discussed many times. It is lack of industrial capacity to produce the weapons and depletion of arsenals to supply the weapons, from which to draw the weapons in order to support Ukraine. So one can see why, faced with that, Western governments, especially the US government, trying to find some way to extricate itself from this debacle, is now looking for ways to blame Ukraine, so staging this meeting in Western Ukraine, knowing perhaps at the back of their minds that Ukraine cannot do the things that the West is asking it to do. That they, that way, are able to blame the Ukrainians for the pullback which is coming. And I'm starting to get reports from Kiev that some people in Ukraine itself, in the Ukrainian leadership, are becoming increasingly angry and are starting to sense that a betrayal of Ukraine is underway. I read a very interesting piece by the American scholar Gordon Hahn, who's very well informed about the situation in Ukraine and who writes extremely intelligently about the conflict there. And I noticed that Gordon Hahn mentioned that amongst the countries that are now being criticised in Kiev is Britain, that certain Ukrainian officials are saying that the British, together with the Americans, are manoeuvring to basically throw Ukraine under the bus, and that there is particular bitterness towards Britain because of the role Britain played in March and April 2022 in getting Ukraine to pull out of the Istanbul agreement. Well, we'll see. We'll see what happens. We'll see what the West does. I don't think it is a fully decided thing. I suspect that there are still some US officials, people like Victoria Nuland, for example, who are not reconciled to a defeat in Ukraine, who are going to pull every lever they can in Washington to try to keep support for Ukraine strong over the course of the next year. But as I said, I sense that this big meeting between US and British military officers and Ukrainian military officers may be a further sign that the West is starting to pull back. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say about this. Now, there's been a lot of discussion in various emails about my point yesterday that I thought that while the Dnieper might serve as an effective military barrier, it would not be an effective political barrier, that splitting Ukraine down the Dnieper line would in effect deal Ukraine a massive blow from which what was left of Ukraine on the western Ukraine, a massive blow from which it would not recover. I absolutely maintain that view. I think that people overlooked the fact that I said that there would have to be a political settlement between the Russians and the Ukrainians. If there's any possibility, any idea of creating a border along the Dnieper, it would have to be an open border, allowing trade and people to move backwards and forwards. And if that were to happen, then obviously the Ukraine that emerged out of it, with its frontier on the Dnieper, would to all intents and purposes become a dependency of Russia. Now that might be what would happen, but anyway, that's my view. Now let us turn to other topics, and I think it is mentioned first the gathering crisis in West Africa. Now, I had thought that an ECOWAS intervention had been called off a short time ago. In fact, I even did a program in which I said as much. It seems there's been massive pressure, both within the ECOWAS countries and I suspect coming from the Western countries, from the United States and France, upon ECOWAS to intervene. And it seems 12,000 men, an ECOWAS force of 12,000 men, has been assembled to intervene in Niger, to march on the capital, and presumably to restore the civilian president. And I have to also say that even as that is happening, I have been seeing signs of troop movements, increasing signs of troop movements from Niger's allies, or rather I should say the current government of Niger's allies in Burkina Faso and Mali. They seem to be preparing to deploy troops to Niger as well. There's been parades and all of that kind of thing. A show of force. And beyond that, the Niger government seems to be busy creating its own militia. And word is also coming out that they've demanded that the French ambassador quit Niger, but the French government is holding back. It's not allowing him. It's refusing to let him leave. Now, all of this, I have to say, fills me with acute concern. The African Union has come out against an ECOWAS intervention in Niger. So it is far from being the case that most African countries support this intervention. A majority of them clearly do not. West Africa, it seems to me, is going to be split between those countries that support the intervention in Niger and those which oppose it. Niger is a very big country, territorially speaking. It may not have a very strong military, but I do ask myself whether 12,000 men is going to be anywhere near enough to control a country of this size, especially against a population which apparently supports the present military government, and some of whom seem to be prepared to take up arms to defend it. I can very easily see how all of this could go disastrously wrong. No doubt the ECOWAS force will finally reach the capital, and maybe the military leaders will be overthrown. But past experience shows that it's after this happens that the real problems begin, that things start to get much worse, and a spiral of violence begins to take over, spiral of resistance, perhaps some would say. But anyway, a conflict which, given how many countries are aligning one way or the other, it's going to be extremely difficult to contain in Niger. Now, I would have thought that by now we would have learnt this lesson, that simple interventions in countries really are never straightforward as their authors, at least their Western authors, imagine, that they lead to all sorts of problems. And of course, if we have a major crisis in Niger, a crisis not just in Niger but across West Africa, it seems to me that the immediate beneficiaries will be the various jihadi groups that are fighting there, which will become emboldened and which will become strengthened as the various militaries of these countries, instead of fighting these jihadi groups, start increasingly to fight each other. And of course, one does also wonder whether a military intervention in Niger, what that will do to the internal stability of some of these West African countries that might be engaged in it. Nigeria has had a complex history since it achieved independence. It's experienced many coups, a very bloody civil war, a insurgency in the north, a jihadi insurgency in the north. I would not personally want to take risks with Nigeria's long-term stability by manoeuvring it into a conflict of this kind. Senegal, or so it seems to me, has been a stronger and more stable country, at least a more stable country than Nigeria. But of course, if a war takes place and expands across West Africa, one wonders whether Senegal can remain an island of stability as the crisis evolves. And the same, I would have thought, applies to other places like Côte d'Ivoire and other places that might find themselves getting drawn into this thing. The other thing I would say about it is that it does continue to seem to me completely unnecessary. Obviously, the Western powers are not happy with the coup in Niger, but I really cannot see why this coup in itself can be said to affect their overall geopolitical position. No doubt, the coup regime, if it consolidates itself, will develop friendlier relations with China and Russia. But why see everything as a zero-sum game? Why assume that that will make Niger somehow hostile to France and especially to the United States? I would have thought that Niger would want to sell its uranium and its lithium and its other minerals anyway, and eventually, once things had sorted themselves out, it would go back to its historic customers, which are France and the other Western states. So, once again, we see extraordinary risks being taken. Risks with internal stability in the region, risks with the internal stability of some of these states, for little real purpose or potential gain, with a very real risk that if a war takes off, and an armed conflict takes off, and the war spreads in the way that I've said, we will not just have massive instability in West Africa, but a humanitarian catastrophe there as well, which will, of course, immediately impact, through refugee flows and other things, the internal situation in Europe as well. I can never understand why Western policymakers just go on repeating the same mistake time and again. Perhaps about Niger itself I'm wrong. Perhaps when the ECOWAS force moves in, everything will turn out right. The regime there will collapse. The civilian government, a civilian government aligned with the West, will take its place. The country will continue peacefully along its normal life. The neighbouring states, Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad, will accept the outcome, and their threats to intervene will be exposed as a bluff. I mean, I am not familiar with the situation in the region. Perhaps it will all turn out right, or at least right from a Western point of view. Even then, I'm not sure how right it would be for the people of Niger, but that's another matter. But what if it doesn't? What if it all goes horribly wrong in the way that I've said? All I can say is that in that case, what we will have is not just another crisis in West Africa, as I said, affecting the stability of Europe, but the people who will have authored it in Paris and in Washington, having refused to learn this lesson before, will no doubt continue to refuse to learn this lesson again, and probably their response will be to double down either in West Africa or somewhere else and do this thing all over again. Anyway, we've been doing a series of programs on the Duran with Jeffrey Sachs, with Professor Jeffrey Sachs, the economist, and he's been pointing out how there's been this constant pattern of US and Western interventions and regime change attempts and coups in all kinds of places, and how this, more than anything else, has led to so much of the instability and chaos and misery and poverty and economic collapse that there's been around the world. He also pointed out how few of these coups in the end have succeeded. Some have been a failure right from the outset. Some have been even wider failures. They have perhaps succeeded initially, but at the cost of making the countries where they were launched far less stable, and that has led to all sorts of conflicts and crises in these places. And he says that despite this habit of meddling and interfering and launching these coups has become compulsive, one might almost say addictive, and it's an addiction that Western leaders, especially American leaders, simply don't seem able to kick. Well, we may be seeing that all over again in Niger, but I will say this, coming back to that last programme we did on the Duran with Professor Sachs, which I discussed yesterday on my programme, the one about the expansion of the BRICS and the way in which that has the potential to change the world. Well, isn't that an outcome of precisely this kind of pattern of intervention that we've been talking, that Professor Sachs and we on the Duran have been talking about? Countries around the world, China, Russia, India, South Africa, Brazil, Egypt, Ethiopia, the Persian Gulf states, they're saying to themselves, we can't ultimately continue to work within this Western framework, because instead of it providing us with security and stability, it is in effect doing exactly the opposite. And of course, India, to be very clear, is no exception, because of course the West has been interfering in India as well. I can remember times when the United States and Britain were not happy with the fact that India was seeking good relations with the Soviet Union, and of course they're unhappy about the fact that India is now seeking good relations or maintaining good relations with Russia. They want India to stop buying oil from Russia, despite the effect that that would have on India's internal economy. It would cause prices of energy and therefore of food to rise in India. There's been an article in the Financial Times on precisely this very thing. We're told that India shouldn't worry about that, but of course India has to worry about that, because so many people in India live on the margins of existence. This is true, even despite the enormous increase in the Indian economy that we've seen over the last 30 years, but there's still huge amount of poverty in India. And India can't just ignore the plight of its own people in the kind of way that the West appears to want it to do. And the result is that India seeks to preserve its relationship, its economic and commercial and business relationship with Russia, and it does so because it must. If it is going to focus on its own living standards and the needs of its own people. But of course it also goes beyond that, because the West in the past has shown an interest in places like Kashmir, in the Punjab, in other parts of India where the Indian governments have had difficulties. And of course the Indians, even governments like the current one, would seek good relations with the United States, understand that the Western system ultimately does not work to India's advantage or India's stability or India's future prosperity in the way and to the extent that it should. And that's why, contrary to all Western expectations, they've gone along with all of these ideas that came out of the BRICS meeting. And I noticed that one of the most interesting meetings that took place during the BRICS summit was the one between Prime Minister Modi of India and President Xi Jinping of China. And I also remember Professor Sachs telling us in another program some months ago that people that he'd been speaking to in this part of the world, he has many contacts in many parts of the world, were dropping hints or suggestions that at some point, perhaps over the next few months, India and China would make a serious, concerted effort to sort out their mutual problems. And it seems to me that this is precisely what we're starting to see. In the meantime, there is the issue of China and the economy of China. And of course, again, lots of articles have been circulating about China, about its economic problems. Professor Sachs has made it clear that he thinks that these are, at least to a certain extent, to a great extent even, the consequences of US attempts to contain China, which are openly discussed, by the way, in the media, to strangle China's economic growth, to suffocate China in order to preserve the US position. Well, there was a very interesting editorial on this very topic in Global Times newspaper, Chinese newspaper, which, as I've said many times, mirrors closely the opinions of the Chinese leadership. It says that the development of China will shatter all bad-mouthing voices. And it says that the so-called China economic collapse theory has been resurfacing in Western public opinion lately. Interestingly, whilst these people try their best to badmouth China's current economy, they acknowledge the performance and achievements of Chinese economy in the past, creating a comparison in which they revere the past and neglect the present. There's some truth in this, in the sense that I can remember many articles denying that Chinese economic growth was entirely real. But anyway, it goes on to say the truth is they are or belong to the same group of people who have been advocating the Chinese economic collapse theory for over 40 years. Their conclusions were made long ago and their logic remains the same. The only thing that changes is the corresponding materials based on different periods of reality. Each round of the Chinese economic collapse theory ended with the theory's own collapse, and this round will be no exception. And then it says that the Chinese economy does indeed face new challenges. It talks about how a recent meeting of the Politburo, the Chinese top decision-making body, the top decision-making body of the Communist Party of China, that it met and that it's looked at the overall situation, and it says that the Global Times article says that after a steady shift for the better in epidemic prevention and control, China's economic recovery has been progressing with twists and turns. The economy has tremendous resilience and potential for development, and its long-term sound fundamentals remain unchanged. These summaries and judgments are realistic without evading problems. These are the ones by the Politburo, and have a high degree of certainty. There may be waves and setbacks which may make for a bumpy ride for China's giant economic ship, but it will never have the catastrophic consequences or reverse its direction. And then we get the key point that narratives are full of contradictory logic. 1 second, they may be exaggerating China's economic development, saying it is too fast, posing a threat to Western interests. The next second, they start talking about China's economic decline and suffering, and the suffering that will bring to the world. 1 second, they are taking actions to contain and suppress China's economic development and progress. And the next second, they hypocritically express concerns about the risks caused by China's economic weakness. And as we can see, there you have the recognition of the fact when the Chinese economy is strong, the Western powers take actions to contain and suppress its growth. That's there in Global Times editorial. When those effects at containing and suppressing China's economic development and progress are, if only partly successful, then we have the new argument that China's supposed economic weakness, which axiomatically is homegrown, well, that is a threat, a different type of threat to the world. The only thing that never changes when China is growing or when it is not growing is that China is a threat. Anyway, the key point is that the article, the editorial, does still express confidence that China will be able to get through. It says that if one looks back at what has happened, China has faced far greater obstacles in the past, and it has been able to overcome them today with far greater levels of governmental and political sophistication and economic understanding in China, and with vastly greater resources than before. China has the means to overcome whatever problems are imposed upon it by the West. I am sure this is right. China does face challenges. Professor Sachs has talked about the challenges the West is imposing upon it, which are real. And there are also problems within the Chinese domestic economy. But I've no doubt that the Chinese will find their way through. And moreover, and this is the key takeaway from this article, one consequence of all of these attempts that the West is making to keep China down is that it is convincing the leadership in China, and I suspect large numbers of people in China, that the West, far from being their friend, is their enemy, and that will have massive long-term consequences for the future. It also, by the way, means that to the extent that the problems of the Chinese economy are actually homegrown, the Chinese government has now been handed the perfect alibi. They can quite properly point out that the West is trying to contain and suppress China, and that any problems that China is facing, which can be overcome, are not the fault of the Chinese government, but are purely and entirely the fault of the West. In fact, trying to suppress China in this way actually probably increases the political space that the Chinese government has in order to do the things that are necessary to make sure that China overcomes whatever problems it faces. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say today in this programme. We covered a lot of ground. We will see how much further this Ukrainian offensive can go, and I personally would not be surprised if we see an ECOWAS intervention and a crisis in West Africa before long, which actually ousts Ukraine as the lead topic in world headlines. And if we also see, over the next few months, major moves, as Professor Sachs said might happen, between China and India to reconcile their problems. So let me repeat again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop, where you can get all the amazing things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.